This growing tension did not escape the attention of the world's naval powers. Fears of a costly and destabilizing arms race led to international efforts to limit naval construction. The 5-to-5-to-3 ship ratio, which allocated relative battleship tonnage to the United States, Britain, and Japan, was established by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. The London Naval Conference of 1930 extended and modified these limits as the United States, Britain, and Japan sought further agreements on battleships and other warships. For Japan, the agreements were a bittersweet acknowledgment of its position. Unable to match the industrial might of the United States, Japanese leaders realized that a naval race would be unsustainable in the long run. Yet the compromise also meant accepting limits on their ambitions, a source of growing frustration among Japan's more militarist elements. Long before dawn broke over the Hawaiian Islands on December 7, 1941, a fleet of Japanese warships silently approached from the north, engines throttled low to avoid detection. On board, pilots studied photographs and maps, reviewing their targets and rehearsing the sequence of the coming assault. The operation had been planned with meticulous secrecy and a singular aim: to cripple the United States Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor, thereby buying Japan the time and freedom it needed to secure its expanding empire in Southeast Asia. For most Americans, Sunday morning began like any other. Yet within hours, the world would change irrevocably as the Pacific erupted into war. The motivations leading to this moment had deep roots. Japan's leaders, facing a dire shortage of oil and other vital resources, watched with mounting alarm as the United States imposed embargoes in response to Japanese military expansion, source 29. By the summer of 1941, American sanctions had cut off nearly all oil exports to Japan, threatening to grind its war machine to a halt. Confronted with what they saw as an existential crisis, Japanese strategists concluded that their only path forward was to secure the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, particularly the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, source 27-26. Yet a formidable obstacle stood in their way: the United States Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, which had the potential to disrupt Japan's conquest plans. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, understood the risks. He is famously credited with warning that striking at America might awaken a sleeping giant, unleashing a power greater than any Japan had yet faced, source 25. Nevertheless, the Japanese High Command calculated that a surprise blow, delivered with overwhelming force, could cripple American naval power in the Pacific long enough for Japan to consolidate its new empire. The attack on Pearl Harbor, in this sense, was envisioned not as an end in itself, but as a flanking raid, one domino in a broader campaign that would sweep across Southeast Asia, source 28. In the pre-dawn darkness, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched more than 350 aircraft in 2 distinct waves. Their targets were chosen with care: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and the airfields at Hickam and Wheeler, whose planes might otherwise take to the skies in defense. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs and torpedoes fell, shattering the morning calm, source 30-32. Eyewitness accounts from servicemen and civilians alike recall the confusion and terror as explosions ripped through the harbor, ships rolled and capsized, and columns of black smoke rose into the sky, source 40, 41, 42, 43. In the chaos, sailors scrambled to battle stations, some still in pajamas, while others leapt into burning, oil-slicked water to escape sinking ships. The attack unfolded with brutal efficiency. Within minutes, bombs struck the USS Arizona, igniting her forward magazines in a catastrophic blast that killed over 1,000 men instantly. The USS Oklahoma capsized after being hit by multiple torpedoes, trapping hundreds below decks. In all, 21 ships were damaged or destroyed, including 8 battleships. Nearly 200 American aircraft were caught on the ground and destroyed or crippled, source 30, 31, 32, 33. The human cost was staggering: more than 2,400 Americans killed and over 1,000 wounded, source 58. Civilians, too, were caught in the maelstrom, as bombs and stray gunfire struck neighborhoods and schools on the island of Oahu, source 41-42. Yet even amid the devastation, there were glimmers of fortune for the United States. Most crucially, the American aircraft carriers, Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga, were not in port that morning. Their absence would prove decisive in the battles to come, source 39. Repair yards, fuel depots, and submarine pens also survived largely unscathed, allowing the Pacific Fleet to recover more quickly than the Japanese had anticipated, source 38. Still, in the immediate aftermath, the sense of shock and loss was profound. Reports from witnesses describe a harbor choked with burning wrecks, the air thick with the acrid smell of fuel and cordite, and the haunting silence that followed after the last planes departed, source 40, 41, 42. From the Japanese perspective, the attack was initially seen as a resounding success. Japanese pilots radioed back news of battleships ablaze and dockyards in ruins. Tokyo's military leaders celebrated the achievement, believing they had struck a crippling blow to American naval power, Source 44. Yet the jubilation was tempered by an awareness of the risks to come. Yamamoto and others in the high command worried that the attack, far from cowing the United States, would only harden its resolve for war, Source 25. The phrase sleeping giant would soon echo in American newspapers and speeches, capturing the mood of a nation stunned but galvanized by the assault. Across the United States, news of the attack swept the country with lightning speed. Radio bulletins interrupted Sunday programming, families gathered around their sets, struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. President Roosevelt, upon receiving word, convened his cabinet and military advisors, swiftly concluding that the nation was now at war. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan with near-unanimous support, a moment that marked the United States' irrevocable entry into World War II, Source 34, 35, 36, 58. Public opinion, once divided over involvement in the conflict raging in Europe and Asia, now coalesced in a wave of anger and unity, Source 36. The consequences of Pearl Harbor were immediate and far-reaching. The attack not only brought the United States into the war, but also led to sweeping changes at home. In the days and weeks that followed, the government launched a massive mobilization effort, enlisting millions of men and women, shifting industry to war production, and organizing the logistics of a two-ocean conflict, Source 35, 36. At the same time, fear and suspicion gripped the country, culminating in policies that would see Japanese Americans on the West Coast forcibly interned. One of the most controversial episodes of the war's home front, Source 35, 36. For the world's navies, Pearl Harbor was a watershed. The attack revealed both the possibilities and vulnerabilities of modern naval warfare. Battleships, once the pride of the fleet, had been devastated from the air. Aircraft carriers absent on that fateful morning were now recognized as the true capital ships of the age, Source 3739. Naval doctrine shifted rapidly, with fleets reorganized around carrier task forces and new investments made in radar, anti-aircraft defenses, and damage control. The lessons of Pearl Harbor would shape every major engagement in the Pacific that followed, from the Coral Sea to Midway and beyond, Source 37. Pearl Harbor's legacy endures not only in policy and strategy, but in the memories of those who experienced it firsthand. Survivors of the attack, both military and civilian, have recalled the fear and chaos, the acts of bravery and loss, and the profound sense of history being written before their eyes, Source 40, 41, 42, 43. Their stories, preserved in memoirs and oral histories, remind us that behind the headlines and strategy, war is lived by individuals, each swept up in the tide of events beyond their control. The attack on Pearl Harbor marked the dawn of a new era in the Pacific, one defined by total war, innovation, and, ultimately, the immense human cost of global conflict. In a single morning, the balance of power shifted, alliances crystallized, and the fate of nations was altered. As American ships burned and the nation mourned, the resolve to fight was forged, and the Pacific would soon become the stage for one of the most dramatic naval struggles in history. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, the tides of war were shaped not only by the courage of sailors, but also by the shifting strategies, technologies, and decisions of those commanding fleets from distant flag bridges. In the early months after America's entry into World War II, the Pacific Ocean became a chessboard of immense scale. Its islands as pawns, carriers as queens, and every movement fraught with the possibility of disaster or deliverance. The story of the Pacific Naval War is, at its heart, a tale of turning tides, moments when the balance of power pivoted, often in the wake of desperate gambles, flashes of insight, and the relentless pursuit of advantage. From the outset, the United States was forced to rethink its Pacific strategy. What began as a defensive struggle soon evolved into a two-pronged offensive, with American forces advancing from both the Central Pacific and the Southwest Pacific. This painstaking and costly approach sought to leapfrog from island to island, seizing key locations and bypassing others, always with the goal of tightening the noose around Japan's empire. Central to this effort were the aircraft carriers and submarines, which became the sharp edge of the Allied advance. The gradual shift from a defensive to an offensive posture involved more than just moving ships and men. It required learning new ways to fight, to think, and to command. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 marked one of the first critical confrontations of this new era. It was the world's first naval battle in which opposing ships never sighted one another, an engagement fought entirely by aircraft launched from carriers hundreds of miles apart. The Japanese sought to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea, hoping to threaten Australia and strengthen their southern perimeter. American codebreakers, piecing together Japanese intentions, enabled United States commanders to intercept the invasion force. In the ensuing clash, both sides suffered heavy losses. The carrier Lexington was sunk and Yorktown damaged, while Japan lost the light carrier Shoho and saw its plans for Port Moresby thwarted. Although the tactical outcome was indecisive, the strategic result was clear. Japan's momentum had been checked, and the myth of unstoppable Japanese naval power was dispelled. Yet it was at Midway, just a month later, that the true turning of the tide occurred. The Japanese, under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, launched a bold plan to lure out and destroy the remaining American carriers, hoping to secure dominance in the Central Pacific. What they did not know was that American cryptanalysts, working tirelessly in cramped, sweltering rooms, had broken key elements of the Japanese naval code. By intercepting and deciphering messages, United States commanders, including Admiral Chester Nimitz, were able to anticipate the Japanese attack on Midway Atoll and prepare a deadly ambush. On the morning of June 4, 1942, as Japanese planes attacked the island, American carrier-based aircraft launched waves of strikes against the Japanese fleet. The battle unfolded with moments of confusion, missed opportunities, and sudden reversals. At a crucial juncture, United States dive bombers discovered 3 of Japan's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, clustered together, their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. In a matter of minutes, bombs rained down, igniting catastrophic fires and crippling the heart of Japan's carrier force. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was also sunk before the day was out. In exchange, the Americans lost the battered Yorktown, but the scale of the Japanese defeat was unprecedented. Midway's significance cannot be overstated. 4 Japanese carriers, the core of their naval striking power, were lost along with many veteran pilots and crewmen. The technological and tactical factors that shaped the battle's superior intelligence, effective use of radar, and advances in aircraft design were decisive. The American victory at Midway forced the Japanese Navy onto the defensive, erasing its numerical advantage in carriers and shifting the initiative to the Allies. In the aftermath, both fleets studied the lessons of the battle with grim determination. The United States Navy improved carrier tactics, damage control procedures, and the integration of intelligence into operational planning. For the Japanese, the loss of experienced aircrews would prove irreplaceable. As the war ground on, the struggle for Guadalcanal in late 1942 and early 1943 became another crucible of naval warfare. Here, in the waters known as Iron Bottom Sound, a series of desperate night battles raged as both sides committed ships and men to control the island's vital airfield. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, battleships and cruisers exchanging broadsides at point-blank range, destroyers darting through darkness, and torpedoes streaking through the black water. The outcome was often uncertain until the last shell was fired. Yet gradually, the momentum began to tilt toward the Allies. Japanese losses mounted, particularly in destroyers and transports, eroding their ability to supply and reinforce isolated garrisons. The experience gained in these engagements, learning to fight at night, to coordinate air and sea power, to adapt to the unforgiving environment, proved invaluable. Guadalcanal was not just a campaign of attrition, but a forging ground for new tactics and hardened leaders. Underlying these battles was a profound transformation in naval technology and doctrine. The rise of the aircraft carrier had been anticipated by some, but the Pacific War made it an undeniable reality. Carriers, rather than battleships, became the decisive weapons, able to project power across vast distances, strike at enemy fleets, and support amphibious landings on distant shores. American carriers, operating in coordinated task forces, could launch massed airstrikes, defend themselves with layers of fighters and anti-aircraft guns, and recover from damage with remarkable speed. Technological advances such as improved radar, sonar, and torpedoes gave commanders new tools for detection, targeting, and defense. Innovations in ship design, such as reinforced hull structures, increased survivability and operational reach. The interconnectedness of Atlantic and Pacific naval operations also meant that lessons learned in one theater could be applied in another, accelerating the pace of adaptation. The Japanese, for their part, struggled to match the pace of American innovation. Although their early successes had been built on well-trained aviators and daring tactics, the attrition of experienced crews at battles like Midway and Guadalcanal took a toll that could not be made good. The Japanese Navy's reliance on battleship doctrine and the difficulty of replacing lost carriers and pilots compounded their troubles. Meanwhile, American shipyards and logistics networks, powered by an industrial juggernaut, were able to churn out new carriers, aircraft, and submarines at a rate that far outstripped Japanese production. All these elements converged in the epic confrontation at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. As General Douglas MacArthur's forces prepared to invade the Philippines, the Japanese Navy assembled its remaining strength to challenge the Allied landing. The ensuing battle sprawled across hundreds of miles, involving dozens of warships, hundreds of aircraft, and multiple simultaneous engagements. American and Australian naval forces, relying on superior logistics, radar, and coordinated carrier strikes, blunted each Japanese thrust. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. Their fleet was shattered as an effective fighting force, and the Allies secured their beachheads in the Philippines. Leyte Gulf was not merely a contest of ships and sailors, but a showcase of the new face of naval warfare: distributed operations, precise logistics, and the overwhelming power of carrier-based aviation. The logistical feat of sustaining vast fleets thousands of miles from home, supplying fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, was as crucial as any tactical maneuver. The Japanese Navy, unable to replace its losses, was reduced to a shadow of its former might, ceding control of the seas to the Allies. As the war entered its final phase, the lessons of these turning-point battles were clear. The integration of intelligence, the mastery of new technologies, and the willingness to adapt tactics in the face of adversity had shifted the Pacific tide. Command decisions, sometimes bold, sometimes cautious, shaped the outcome as much as firepower or numbers. The great naval battles of the Pacific were not just clashes of mettle and will, but milestones in the evolution of modern warfare, where the interplay of strategy, technology, and human ingenuity determined the fate of nations. In the final months of the Pacific War, the vastness of the ocean seemed to shrink as Allied forces closed in on Japan from every direction. The campaigns of this closing phase were relentless and costly, shaped by years of brutal conflict and the rapid pace of technological change. On remote islands and in the waters that connected them, the struggle unfolded not only between ships and aircraft, but also in the minds of commanders whose decisions would determine the fate of empires. By 1945, the Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former self. Yet the prospect of a final invasion of the home islands remained a daunting challenge for Allied planners. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, though not detailed here, exemplified the ferocity with which Japanese forces defended their territory and the staggering sacrifices demanded of both attackers and defenders. The weight of logistics, the coordination of joint operations, and the overwhelming power of new weapons all combined to create an environment where every engagement felt like both an ending and a beginning. At the heart of this new era of warfare stood the aircraft carrier. No longer an experiment or a risky addition to battleship fleets, the carrier had become the true queen of the seas. Its floating airfields projected power far beyond the reach of guns or torpedoes, and its mobility allowed for strikes deep into enemy territory or rapid redeployment in response to shifting threats. The evolution of carrier doctrine, driven by necessity, and the crucible of combat left a legacy that extended long after the war's end. In the final campaigns, carrier task forces coordinated waves of air attacks, reconnaissance, and anti-submarine patrols in ways scarcely imaginable a decade earlier. Japan's defeat unfolded as a cascade of converging pressures. Carrier-based air power struck at the heart of Japanese industry and transportation, severing the arteries that sustained the war effort. Submarines prowled the shipping lanes, further isolating the home islands. The relentless tempo of Allied advances, combined with the devastation of strategic bombing, left Japan unable to halt or reverse the tide. Against this backdrop of mounting inevitability, the world witnessed the sudden and terrible debut of atomic weapons. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, together with the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, precipitated final surrender. The official notification of Japan's surrender reached the fleets that had fought their way across the Pacific, marking the end of a conflict that had redefined the very meaning of naval power. The immediate aftermath of surrender brought its own challenges and transformations. The once mighty Japanese Navy was dismantled, its ships scuttled or scrapped, and the nation itself placed under Allied occupation. Under the guidance of figures like General Douglas MacArthur, Japan entered a period of reconstruction and political reform, its military ambitions forcibly curtailed. The devastation of war was matched by profound social and economic upheaval, as millions of Japanese faced the daunting task of rebuilding in a landscape marked by loss and uncertainty. Yet even as the guns fell silent, the legacy of the Pacific War began to shape the world that followed. The experience of vast carrier operations, the integration of air and sea power, and the logistical feats required to sustain fleets across thousands of miles became the foundation for post-war military doctrine. The United States Navy, emerging from the conflict with unmatched power and reach, found itself at the center of a new global order. The rapid demobilization that followed the war's end brought a dramatic reduction in ships and personnel, but the lessons of the Pacific remained deeply embedded in the Navy's institutional memory. The influence of those lessons can be traced through the decades that followed. The offensive use of naval power honed in the Pacific became a central element of American strategic thinking. The ability to project force across oceans, sustain operations far from home, and adapt rapidly to new threats all were direct outgrowths of wartime experience. The logistical highways established during the war, with island bases and supply depots stretching from Hawaii to the Western Pacific, became permanent features of the United States' presence in the region. This network not only underpinned military operations, but also shaped post-war geopolitics, creating a United States-centric maritime system that would influence the balance of power for generations. The Pacific War's impact extended beyond ships and strategies. It reshaped the very concept of what naval power could achieve. The integration of air and sea forces, the use of intelligence and code-breaking, and the emphasis on flexibility and innovation became hallmarks of modern navies. The carrier, once a symbol of daring experiment, was now the backbone of naval supremacy. In subsequent conflicts and crises, the carrier task force will be deployed as a tool of diplomacy, deterrence, and, when necessary, devastating force. At the same time, historians and naval strategists have continued to debate the true meaning of the Pacific campaigns. Some argue that the war's emphasis on offensive operations and carrier power led to flawed paradigms in later decades, while others see in the Pacific experience a blueprint for success in a rapidly changing world. The reduction in naval forces after the war, driven by budget constraints and a desire for peace, was tempered by an awareness that new challenges could arise with little warning. The lessons of the Pacific about readiness, adaptability, and the interplay of technology and doctrine remain subjects of study and, at times, controversy. Geopolitically, the war transformed the Pacific from a distant frontier into a central theater of great power rivalry. The island chains seized, fortified, and fought over during the war became the backbone of America's post-war defensive posture, a strategic frontier that endured through the Cold War and into the present era. The United States' presence in the Pacific, enabled by maritime power and reinforced by wartime experience, became both a stabilizing force and a point of contention in subsequent decades. The memory of how quickly the balance of power could shift, how vulnerable far-flung territories could be to sudden attack-shaped policies and priorities for a generation of leaders. As the world entered the atomic age, the technological legacy of the Pacific War drove further innovation. The pace of naval development accelerated, with new classes of ships, advanced aircraft, and more sophisticated weapon systems entering service. The challenge of adapting to this rapid change persisted, but the foundation laid in the crucible of the Pacific proved robust. The United States Navy, in particular, emerged as a force capable not only of waging war but also of shaping the peace that followed. Looking back across the expanse of the Pacific, the war's legacy is evident in the enduring importance of maritime power, the continued relevance of island chains and logistical highways, and the lessons, both triumphant and tragic, drawn from a conflict that tested the limits of strategy, technology, and human endurance. The Pacific War was not simply a contest of fleets or a series of battles. It was a transformative moment that redefined the possibilities and responsibilities of naval power in the modern world. Its imprint can still be seen in the strategies, alliances, and rivalries that shape the Indo-Pacific today, a testament to the enduring consequences of victory at sea.